and try and chop his head off and smash his teeth, so if he was ever found that they wouldn't identify him. And this was all told to me by a chap called Carl Mengler, who was the policeman who inquired into all this. And Mengler says that Clark then went back to Thielmann's house and ate the roast pork. But so I don't know if that's all true or not, but that's what the police told me.
Sounds pretty evil.
Apparently he was. Clark was quite a ladies' man. I mean, people talk about him. He had a lot of charm and sophistication in some ways. And according to Peter Fulcher, I mean, his abiding interest in life was women. You know, he wanted money and women, and that was what he worked for.
How many other murders were there?
Well, sort of officially, they sort of link him to 6, but according to Fulcher, it's probably 8, and that's so he killed 3. Well, he ordered the death of 2 people. That was 2 addicts who had been arrested with him in Brisbane in 1975 or 76, and they were talking to police, and Clark managed to buy the tapes of those interviews from the police through his connections from Trimboli. He spent about 100,000 or so buying those, and in those he heard that the Wilsons were talking about him, so he put a hit on them, and a guy called Basley killed them, and he was the guy who, everything sort of links around in circles. He was the guy who Trimboli had allegedly used to kill Donald Mackay a few years earlier. So that's those 2 murders. And then Clark himself killed another guy, Pommy Harry Lewis, who had been arrested for, he was one of the dealers or traffickers, I get confused which one, but he'd been arrested. Clark thought he was about to talk. Clark posted his bail, which was $5,000, and then when he was driving back with him, shot him and left him in the bush again.
How do you get to, in a civilised country, just murder people and then carry on with your everyday life?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the big things that came out of the Mr. Asia was really how unprepared New Zealand and to an extent Australian police were for this sort of level of straight brutality and massive importation. I mean, the Mr. Asia ring was, in its own way, one of the forerunners of the big cartels from Mexico and all that. I mean, these guys just did it, and New Zealand police were so underprepared that, you know, they had an idea things were going on. And when they went to police headquarters, or bullshit towers, as the policemen used to call it, to ask for money to start investigating, they knew, for instance, there was a connection to Perth with boats travelling there. They were told no, they couldn't go to Perth. And so police back then leaked the first details of the group to the Auckland Star, and that's where the Auckland Star started breaking the story. And then it was around that time the murders started happening, and it just skyrocketed. But, you know, in Australia, for instance, how did Clark get away with it? He was so brutal that he wanted people to know that he was killing people. Peter Fulcher in New Zealand said, you know, if you want to kill people, they're all on drugs anyway. You know, give them overdoses and nobody will know. And Clark said, no, I want it as a warning. And so when he killed, he made sure that people in his group knew that those people had been disposed of because he wanted them gone, and it was a warning to them. And equally in Australia with the Wilsons, because Clark had found out that they were talking, and same with Lewis beforehand, the people within the drug syndicate were too scared to talk to police because they knew Clark had insides into the police force and was getting the information back. And on top of it, he had good lawyers and people who were hiding the money, so everything, you know, nobody really connected him to anything.
How did it all end?
It ended with Clark had tried to expand into England. He had moved to England. He'd set up a great big drug deal with Johnson, who was based in Singapore. Johnson was meant to buy a massive load of drugs which were to be shipped to England, where Clark had linked up with a bunch of local crims. Johnson got totally ripped off. He went into a meeting in some forest in Thailand, gave over a lot of money, and got a whole lot of flour or something like that in return. Johnson was called to England. Clark got Johnson's best friend, Andy Marr, the one who had started the business with him, told Marr that you either kill Johnson or I'll kill you. And so Marr met Johnson up in the border of Scotland and England and shot Johnson in the back of the head. And then with another mate, a friend of his from Scotland, James Smith, they hacked the body up, tried to smash the face beyond recognition, cut the hands off, and threw the body into the Eccleston Quarry near Chorley, I think it is, up in northern England. And they would have got away with it all, except they threw it and it landed on a ledge. And if they'd thrown it another metre or so away, it would have fallen to the bottom and probably never been found. But within a week or so, the body was found, identified, and Clark linked to it all. And so Clark was arrested, charged in England. It was the highest security trial in England to that date, and went for about 3 months. And Clark was convicted, and so was one of his New Zealand offsiders, whose name Errol Hinksman. They were both convicted. Clark of
conspiracy.
One of those things, yes. And Hinksman about drugs, and of course Marr and Smith were also convicted. And Clark was sent to Parkhurst Prison, and he died there. But according to Justice Stewart, the man who did the Royal Commission looking into it all, Clark was probably murdered by someone within the prison, because he was narking on people there, and the IRA were alleged to have done that.
Wow. And you have been involved in this case for over 30 years. No, over 40 years.
Oh, yes, my goodness.
Any questions still unanswered?
Oh, there's a couple. I mean, the money. There was so much money, and it sort of evaporated, and you don't know where it's gone. I mean, Clark, there was obvious things like Clark had the house up in Russell, and there was some property in Fiji which was all sort of discovered, but it sort of vanished. And Trimboli being the bank man, and obviously he would have dealt with some of it. So where did the money go? That would be fascinating to find out. But the one that's always most intrigued me is Alison Dine, who was one of Clark's main couriers, one of the women who used to carry drugs in her suitcase, and went on to become his lover. She disappeared. No, she has disappeared. She gave evidence, as I said earlier, against Fulcher and other things. She got immunity from prosecution and guaranteed a witness protection and change of identity. And as I understand, she settled in England. She married. She had some sort of face changing,
Wow.
And has never been seen since. I mean, her family probably know where she is, but they obviously don't talk. But she would have an amazing story, because of all the main players, her and Jimmy Shepherd are the two left standing.
Incredible. Thanks so much for coming in today.
Pleasure.
By the way, getting a lot of love from people texting in saying how much they love your TV show as well.
Oh, it's great. We've got a new one coming out next month, so that'll be good.
Yeah, Lost and Found.
No, it's actually got a new name this year. It's David Lomas Investigates.
Great.
So it's quite intriguing.
Well done. Lovely to speak with you today, David Lomas, on the New Zealand crime story of Mr. Asia.
RNZ News at 3, I'm Paul Brennan. The Prime Minister has announced a national drought relief package.
Hi, I'm Ashton.
Hey,
You do. Do you want to come in this side, David, so I can interview you? Well, kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you very much for coming to today's update on the COVID-19 response. And it's nice to be able to do this in Auckland, and I'm looking forward to taking some of your questions shortly. I've got with me today Dr. Dale Bramley. He's the Chief Executive of Waitemata DHB, and he's the Lead Chief Executive for the Auckland Metro region on this region's response to COVID-19. So he will be able to answer any questions you might have about what the DHBs are doing, both to plan and what they've been doing in treating some of the people who've already been confirmed cases here in New Zealand. So I want to commence by just reiterating that for the 5th consecutive day, there are no additional confirmed or probable cases of COVID-19 in New Zealand. Our case numbers therefore remain unchanged. As you will know, there have been the 5 confirmed cases and the 2 probable cases, and the 2 patients or the 2 cases that required hospital care are now both at home and continue recovering at home. You'll also be aware that the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic overnight. What I can firmly say for New Zealand is that, as Dr. Tedros, the WHO Director General himself said, nothing changes in terms of what we do. We have been acting and planning as if this would be a pandemic for some weeks now, and we continue to plan and respond with pace. Again, WHO Director General Tedros said it doesn't change anything that WHO does, and nor should it change anything that countries do. They should continue to plan and respond aggressively to this situation. One of the areas that district health boards are working closely with their local primary care community on is any arrangements that might need to be in place to support Healthline and primary care to see people who might be suspected of or be probable cases of COVID-19. And this will vary from region to region. It could include dedicating specific hubs to be the ones that see all people with symptoms and, if necessary, do the swabbing there. Or it may involve, in other areas, having nurses able to go out and swab people either at home or at practices. So the planning for that continues apace, and DHBs will have concrete plans in place over the next few days. The Ministry's Expert Technical Advisory Group met again today for a fuller meeting. It's met at least twice in the last week and provided us with further advice on countries of concern. And those will inform changes to the case definition, and therefore anyone who has symptoms, particularly the areas of concern that they may have travelled from. And as you would imagine, in particular, the two areas we're most interested in at the moment are Europe and also the USA. And you will have seen the USA has only just announced some quite drastic travel measures targeted at Europe, and banning any travel from Europe to the USA is my understanding in the for the next 30 days. We're looking at all these developments, and we are continuing to provide daily advice to ministers about New Zealand's response. I can also say that for the cases we have had here, all the close contacts remain in self-isolation and are being followed up daily and monitored by health staff. I do want to reiterate my key message about what people can do, and the most fundamental thing that every New Zealand citizen and other person in this country can do is to make sure that if they are unwell, they do not go out and they do not put others at risk. That will be the mainstay of our collective efforts to address this challenge. This weekend, that is particularly important for concerts and large gatherings that are coming up. And again, the message is please stay at home if you are unwell. And finally, just the North Shore Hospital staff who have been in self-isolation following their contact with a probable case. The majority of those staff are now back at work, and the last of them will be back at work by next Monday, should they remain well. I'm happy to leave my opening comments there, and either I or Dale can answer your questions. Thank you.
Are there any cases at the moment that would meet the definition of a suspected case?
So the number of tests being done each day has increased a lot, and I don't have any information on whether those being tested are suspected or probable. So I can't say that there are any that definitely fit the suspected case.
We've had a caller tell us that there's a clinic in Ashburton, a GP's clinic, that might be affected by coronavirus. Do you know anything about that?
I don't specifically know about that, but what I can say is that our primary care clinics now all have PPE, and they all know how to manage a person who comes in who might be suspected COVID-19. And of course, if testing has been done, we will be able to rule in or out whether that's a positive, a confirmed case within about 24 hours.
You say you're doing more testing. On average, how many tests are you doing a day?
So it varies by day, but yesterday around the country there were at least 100 tests being done. Some of those would have been on possible or probable cases. Some would have been on people who may have been close contacts of other cases who may have developed symptoms, but all our tests yesterday were negative.
When you talk about daily monitoring of close contacts, what exactly does that involve? Is it just a phone call?
Usually it's a phone call. However, everybody knows what symptoms they should be looking out for, and if they develop symptoms, then they proactively call in.
How many examples have you seen of people breaching good isolation rules and protocols?
Well, if we're talking about close contacts who are in self-isolation, because of the daily contact and close oversight, those people are very compliant with that. I think
being non-compliant?
not that I've been told of. I think in the case of others who may be self-isolating because of travel from an area of concern, I've said this before, at the moment we're operating in an environment where it's high trust. I think there's a high degree of acceptability and a high degree of social expectation that people will self-isolate. However, we are also asking for advice about what some of the other options might be to help ensure that we can enforce self-isolation more rigorously if we need to.
What do you mean by
When will you
that? What
start
do you mean by that? Sorry,
wide-scale
can you clarify?
community testing, and where will the
I'll come back
capacity
to
come from?
Sorry, could you just say that question again?
When will you start wide-scale community testing?
Right.
And where will the capacity come from?
So at the moment, we are testing people who are symptomatic and who might fit the definition for being a probable or suspected case of COVID-19. And more testing is happening all the time. At the moment, our labs can do over 500 tests in a regular day between them if they need to. And there is the possibility of scaling that up if they put extra shifts of staff on. As you know, at the moment, we're nowhere near using that capacity, but we are able to scale up capacity further if needs be.
Dr. Linfield, can you clarify what you mean by looking at further steps to make sure people are isolating? What options are you looking at?
I've asked for advice on some options because I think it's something we need to ensure we know what the options might be.
So why? Are you worried that as more people are isolated, that some people won't follow the rules?
No, I think what we're looking at is how other countries that have been successful in stopping sometimes quite wide community outbreaks, and one of the key actions that helps stop further spread is effective self-isolation, and what we're interested in doing is seeing how would you apply that in the New Zealand setting.
Does that include legal options to enforce isolation?
I absolutely think that would be one of the options, yes.
So what happens when you might need to shut down a school, for example? Are schools ready and prepared to teach students online, wholesale?
They're very much preparing for that sort of eventuality.
Are they ready to go now?
We would have to ask the Ministry of Education that, but that's something they've been looking at, yes, I know, as part of their planning.
What would you say to schools who are concerned that you're not doing enough quickly enough?
About what would they be concerned about there?
Testing regimes, the number of people you're testing and people you aren't testing.
Yeah. So the key thing here is, and we've learnt this from the evidence from other countries that have already had outbreaks, is the important thing is to test people who are symptomatic and to isolate close contacts. And that's exactly what we are doing, and informing anyone who might be a casual contact or who has travelled from an area of concern who is asymptomatic, what are the symptoms they should look out for and what should they do if they become symptomatic.
How do you keep their confidence though? Because you'll be aware that a number of people, a number of schools have written to the Ministry of Health
Yes.
and their concerns about how you're handling this.
Yes, they have, and I've written back and I've reiterated these points. I think one of the things that can give us some confidence to date is we still have a small number of cases in this country. We've applied quite assertive measures early, our border restrictions, our measures at the border to ensure everyone has information, and our requirement for quite large numbers of people travelling from overseas to go into self-isolation, and we've seen a high level of compliance with that.
Are their concerns unfounded as laid out in that letter?
I completely understand their concerns, and that's why I've gone back. I think they're two different things. I understand their concerns, and that's why I've provided back some reassurance on my part about the appropriateness of the approach we are taking.
Are you changing anything as a result of the concerns that they raised with you?
Not specifically, no.
Would New Zealand consider a ban such as the US has done?
The travel ban? Well, New Zealand, right from the start, has acted quite early and decisively on travel restrictions and also requiring people to go into self-isolation of coming back. Believe me, this is a very active, under very active consideration.
Just on the number of contacts, can you tell us the number of close contacts of all the cases and the number of casual contacts that you've had to get in touch with?
Dale, have you got the latest numbers? I gave these numbers out on the weekend, and I'm sorry I can't remember them off the top of my head.
You said
But
80% had been contacted yesterday, but you didn't have a number with it.
no, so three things. Okay, first of all, the number of close contacts is dozens. The number of casual contacts, of course, especially when you take into account people who were at a music concert, would be in the hundreds. And for most of them, for some of them, it's direct calls from Healthline, others it's ensuring they've got the information. The comment yesterday about the 80% figure was that the evidence suggests that to be successful in stopping further onward transmission, you need to be able to find and isolate 80% of the close contacts.
Right, and
Yes.
have you, so you have got
Yep.
the close contacts?
Most definitely,
and it's,
yes.
You're saying it's not necessary to the casual contacts?
No, the casual contacts, the people are at very low risk of being infected, and the important thing for them to know is what should they be looking out for and what to do if they become symptomatic. And again, just a plug for if people are symptomatic, ring Healthline or ring ahead. Don't turn up at your GP or the emergency department.
And just the people that, I don't know if it might be a question for Dale, the people that have been released that have been sick and in hospital, when it's time for them to go back into the community, what happens? Do they have another test before they're allowed to go out amongst everybody else, or how does that work? Do they have several tests as they're in care?
Well, there's several ways that can be done. So one is they become symptom-free, and sometimes it can be done on the basis of the test as well as negative, and then they're symptom-free after that, and then they're released and they're fine after that. They're no longer infectious.
So if you're symptom-free, you don't need a test to say
No,
this is gone before
yes,
you're out in the
that's right. You need to be symptom-free for a period of time, which we're currently saying is around 48 hours.
What the WHO Director General did say was that we remind all countries we're calling on you to scale up emergency response mechanisms. What would you be reporting that New Zealand has scaled up since that?
We've been scaling up right from the start. In fact, we stood up our National Health Coordination Centre back in January. Remember that the Director General of WHO is addressing a global audience, and I think the effectiveness of our measures to date is apparent in part through the low number of cases we have, and the fact that we have gone early on things like travel restrictions, on self-isolation requirements, and of course our successful case finding and close contact self-isolation to date.
What is your modelling telling you about worst case scenarios in terms of infection rates and numbers?
Nothing at the moment because the modelling work is ongoing. But you can look in, if you look in the pandemic plan, there are some existing figures in there about what potentially could happen if you have a pandemic of an influenza virus that is not managed.
So Germany's Chancellor has said what they think their infection rates will be. How come you don't have a ballpark?
Well, what I would say is that what we have been able to learn over the last 4 to 5 weeks, while we've first kept the virus out and then been able to keep the number of cases low, is we've been able to learn from the successes of countries that have stopped that exponential growth in infections. And so those are the ones we're looking very hard at, because clearly, and the WHO Director General says this every time he speaks, it is not an inevitability that we get an out of control pandemic here. It can be controlled, and what he's doing is encouraging countries to learn from those who have successfully put in control measures.
Because if you look at a lot of those countries, which you will have been, after the first cases appear, it's about 6 to 8 weeks, and then there is an exponential increase in the number of cases they're experiencing. Do you expect New Zealand to show the same pattern?
Again, just to reiterate, it's not the same in every country. There's a big contrast between, for example, Iran and Italy compared with even South Korea, but certainly compared with Taiwan and Singapore.
Do we have 2 strains in New Zealand as suggested by the Chinese study?
I don't know, and I don't think it's relevant to our control efforts. What I would say is I think there's been one paper and it needs to be followed up by further studies. It was an early finding.
So everyone infected in New Zealand, the 5 cases, is it the same, exactly the same virus?
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure. Well, we do know it's the COVID-19 virus. Perhaps one more question.
Okay, what government support is being considered for general practices which suffer COVID-19 losses, such as through loss of staff through self-isolation or sickness?
Yes, so this is an important issue, and we've provided advice to the government around this about what support practices might need, and there's likely to be some announcements about that and perhaps in the next few days. So very much an active part of our planning, in addition to, of course, to the direct support to primary care around providing them with PPE and having them actively involved in our planning efforts.
Can I just make one more? Sorry, just so
Sure.
what's the trigger point for if there is community transmission and we're talking about closing schools or closing streets or areas of New Zealand? What would trigger that and who would make that decision?
So the decisions would be made by government on the advice of officials, which would include health but also others. And one of the comments I made yesterday at the stand-up was, this is different from how perhaps the pandemic plan separate phases have been described, where really what we're looking at is an extended keep it out and stamp it out and slow it down. And with that extended sort of combined approach, we need to use all the tools in the toolbox. And some of those we might use early, like around mass gatherings, selected school closures, asking people to work from home. You may even have measures that are quite different in one geographical location from another. So I think what we've learnt from what other countries have done in this last 4 to 6 weeks is have all the tools available and be prepared to use them preemptively.
And just hypothetically, what might cause, say, a school to be closed or an event to be shut down? What would be the situation?
So if you think about schools, and we've had some instances of this in Australia, if there is either a staff member or a pupil gets infected, then what's happened there is they've shut the school, found the close contacts, self-isolated them, cleaned the school and then reopened. And I think that's, again, we can learn from that and see what the value and the impact of that has been. Yes, please.
Are we growing this in a lab or something, you know, or seeing as it's here, obviously in Australia and various other labs, they're looking at it for coming up with cures and antibodies and all the rest of it. Are we doing anything like that here?
Are we doing any research on the virus here in New Zealand? I'm looking across to my colleague, Dr. Sally Roberts. Are we?
Yes, HRC's released some funding to support research.
Right, so yes, there was an announcement 2 weeks ago. The Health Research Council and Ministry have got a pool of funding, and I imagine this would be one. I don't think we're doing the research quite yet, but we will. But there are proposals being developed.
And do we know yet how long it survives outside of the body, like on the surface?
On fomites, as we call them. Typically these viruses can last for some hours on hard surfaces, and that's why it's important to use good disinfectants and to clean well. Can I leave it at that?
Can we just stay on a few questions before just got on the public health response?
Sure, go right ahead, please do. But just a few.
Okay, yeah, just wondering about in terms of where all the cases have been, what's been done to kind of mobilise or get people ready for potential community transmission here?
Sure, so we have several arms of our response. The first is through the Auckland Regional Public Health Service. So they initially were at the borders and are helping screen people there and assess. The Metro DHBs, that's Waitemata, Auckland and counties, have of this week taken over that border response and increased our presence at the border. So that's the first part of the response. And then the Auckland Regional Public Health Service are also actively follow up all the close contacts. So you had a question about that earlier. So they're up to 252 close contacts that they've been actively following up to date. So they do that and they give advice to the health system here in Auckland about what to do next. Then we have our primary care response. So in primary care, the advice that comes from Healthlines when a patient presents, so they ready themselves to receive that patient and then do the appropriate assessment and the swab if needed. And we help understand all of those people going through that process and collate that here. And then, of course, we have a hospital-based response too, which is making sure we respond very carefully to anybody potentially presenting into our emergency departments or needing admission, wearing the appropriate gear, going to the appropriate room, isolation, and then supportive treatment. At the same time, the Metro DHBs have also stood up an incident management team across the entire city. So we're very much acting as one city here and pulling upon the resources of the 3 DHBs to help staff that response. And we have things in there such as a primary care response, we have planning and intelligent response, logistics, looking at our supply chain for everything that we need. We've got clinical advisory groups and thinking through the treatment, what happens if we see increasing numbers of cases and how should the hospitals respond. And also, as Ashley has just mentioned, the primary care response and being prepared to potentially see more people. So all of those things are underway, and that's actually based here at Auckland City Hospital on behalf of the city.
And if you had to get more more staff in or put people on standby, cancel leave, any of those kind of measures?
Yes, so initially we've drawn this incident management team, the response team from all 3 DHBs coming here, and also some assistance from Northland. We have had to move people to be controllers and take up specific roles, and we're backfilling them back in their home DHBs where we can. For the Auckland Regional Public Health Service too, some of those duties which they were doing we've taken on so we can release their capacity to focus on the contact tracing.
Does that mean you had to cancel leave for anyone or take any different measures in that regard?
We're managing fine at the moment. As things escalate though, that's exactly the type of things that we would be actively thinking through to make sure that we are well staffed. And of course we have winter not too far away, so we need to be mindful of the hospitals are often very busy in winter, and how we manage this through that period. But that's why all the planning is going on right now to prepare for that.
The Medical Association says that containment doesn't work, and it does get out of usually like a wild thing. There will be thousands of deaths in New Zealand. Is that an assessment that you agree with?
I might leave that to Ashley to answer.
Well, that's what they're saying, that if we don't contain it, and that's all I can say is that's why we are putting so much effort into this combined keep it out, stamp it out, slow it down phase. And we've been successful to date, and believe me, we are very focused on identifying what we need to do to ensure we don't end up with that situation of a widespread community outbreak.
But there's thousands of deaths. If it does go wild in the community, it sounds like a correct figure to you.
Well, it's a figure that's been bandied around. What we're focused on is how we avoid that happening. And can I just reiterate one of my key messages again, and thank you. Everyone can contribute by, if you are unwell, stay home, don't put others at risk. Thank you very much for your time.
Actually know who's a pretty successful investor and has been for decades, and he said he watches the shares, and if they get to be 20% or more below what he paid for them, he sells them. But he says, unless the whole market's gone down 20%, but if the market hasn't and those ones have gone down, he says he tries to sell them, but it takes a lot of